Chapter 4. The Search for Meaning. Every man's condition is a solution in hieroglyphic to those inquiries he would put. He acts it as life, before he apprehends it as truth. Ralph Waldo Emerson. 1. The function of the symbol. One of the symptoms of alienation in the modern age is the widespread sense of meaninglessness. Many patients seek psychotherapy not for any clearly defined disorder, but because they feel that life has no meaning. The thoughtful psychotherapist can scarcely avoid the impression that these people are experiencing the disrupting effects not only of an unsatisfactory childhood experience, but also of an upheaval occasioned by a major cultural transition. We seem to be passing through a collective psychological reorientation, equivalent in magnitude to the emergence of Christianity from the ruins of the Roman Empire. Accompanying the decline of traditional religion, there is increasing evidence of a general psychic disorientation. We have lost our bearings. Our relation to life has become ambiguous. The great symbol system which is organized Christianity seems no longer able to command the full commitment of men or to fulfill their ultimate needs. The result is a pervasive feeling of meaninglessness and alienation from life. Whether or not a new collective religious symbol will emerge remains to be seen. For the present, those aware of the problem are obliged to make their own individual search for a meaningful life. Individuation becomes their way of life. I use the word meaning here in a special sense. In general, we can distinguish two different usages of the word. Most commonly, the term refers to abstract, objective knowledge conveyed by a sign or representation. Thus, for example, the word horse means a particular species of four-legged animals, or red traffic light means stop. These are abstract, objective meanings conveyed by signs. However, there is another kind of meaning, namely subjective, living meaning, which does not refer to abstract knowledge, but rather to a psychological state which can affirm life. It is this sense of the word we use when we describe a deeply moving experience as something meaningful. Such an experience does not convey abstract meaning, at least not primarily, but rather living meaning which, laden with affect, relates us organically to life as a whole. Dreams, myths, and works of art can convey the sense of subjective, living meaning, which is quite different from objective, abstract meaning. It is the failure to separate these two different usages of the word meaning which leads one to ask the unanswerable question: what is the meaning of life? The question cannot be answered in this form because it confuses objective, abstract meaning with subjective, living meaning. If we rephrase the question to make it more subjective and ask, what is the meaning of my life, it then begins to have the possibility of an answer. The problem of life meaning is closely related to the sense of personal identity. The question, what is the meaning of my life, is almost the same as the question, who am I? The latter question is clearly a subjective one. An adequate answer can come only from within. Thus we can say meaning is found in subjectivity. But who values subjectivity? When we use the word subjective, we usually say or imply only subjective, as though the subjective element were of no consequence. Since the decline of religion, we have no adequate collective sanction for the introverted, subjective life. All trends are in the opposite direction. The various pressures of Western society all subtly urge the individual to seek life meaning in externals and in objectivity. Whether the goal be the state, the corporate organization, the good material life, or the acquisition of objective scientific knowledge, in each case human meaning is being sought where it does not exist, in externals, in objectivity. The unique, particular, not to be duplicated subjectivity of the individual, which is the real source of human meanings and which is not susceptible to an objective, statistical approach, is the despised stone rejected by the builders of our contemporary worldview. Even the majority of psychiatrists, who ought to know better, contribute to the prevailing attitude which depreciates subjectivity. Some years ago, I gave a paper concerning the function of symbols before a group of psychiatrists. Afterwards, the discussant gave a critique of the paper. One of the chief objections was that I described the symbol as though it were something real, almost alive, as indeed I had. This criticism reflects the general attitude toward the psyche and subjectivity. The psyche is thought to have no reality of its own. Subjective images and symbols are considered to be nothing but reflections of one's environment and interpersonal relations, or nothing but instinctive wish fulfillments. Harry Stack Sullivan, who has even made the extreme statement that the idea of a unique, individual personality is a delusion. A famous psychiatrist thus becomes unwittingly another exponent of collectivistic mass psychology. Modern man's most urgent need is to discover the reality and the value of the inner subjective world of the psyche. To discover the symbolic life, as Jung has said, man is in need of a symbolic life, but we have no symbolic life. Have you got a corner somewhere in your house where you perform the rites as you can see in India? Even the very simple houses there have at least a curtained corner where the members of the household can lead the symbolic life, where they can make their new vows or meditation. We don't have it. We have no time, no place. Only the symbolic life can express the need of the soul, the daily need of the soul, mind you. And because people have no such thing, they can never step out of this mill, this awful, grinding, banal life in which they are nothing but. Man needs a world of symbols as well as a world of signs. Both sign and symbol are necessary, but they should not be confused with one another. A sign is a token of meaning that stands for a known entity. By this definition, language is a system of signs, not symbols. A symbol, on the other hand, is an image or representation which points to something essentially unknown, a mystery. A sign communicates abstract, objective meaning, whereas a symbol conveys living, subjective meaning. A symbol has a subjective dynamism, which exerts a powerful attraction and fascination on the individual. It is a living, organic entity which acts as a releaser and transformer of psychic energy. We can thus say a sign is dead, but a symbol is alive. Symbols are spontaneous, products of the archetypal psyche. One cannot manufacture a symbol. One can only discover it. Symbols are carriers of psychic energy. This is why it is proper to consider them as something alive. They transmit the ego, either consciously or unconsciously, life energy which supports, guides, and motivates the individual. The archetypal psyche is constantly creating a steady stream of living symbolic imagery. Ordinarily, this stream of images is not consciously perceived except through dreams or through waking fantasy when the conscious level of attention has been lowered. However, there is reason to believe that even in the full waking state, this stream of symbols charged with effective energy continues to flow beyond the notice of the ego. Symbols seep into the ego, causing it to identify with them and act them out unconsciously, or they spill out into the external environment via projection, causing the individual to become fascinated and involved with the external objects and activities. 2. The concretistic and reductive fallacies. The relation between the ego and the symbol is a very important factor. In general, there are three possible patterns of relation between ego and symbol, or, which means the same thing, between ego and archetypal psyche. The ego may be identified with the symbol. In this case, the symbolic image will be lived out concretely. Ego and archetypal psyche will be one. 2. The ego may be alienated from the symbol, although the symbolic life cannot be destroyed. In this case, it will function in a degraded fashion outside consciousness. The symbol will be reduced to a sign. Its mysterious urgencies will be understood only in terms of elementary, abstract factors. 3. The third possibility is the one to be desired. In this instance, the ego, which clearly separated from the archetypal psyche, is open and receptive to the effects of symbolic imagery. A kind of conscious dialogue between the ego and emerging symbols becomes possible. The symbol is then able to perform its proper function as a releaser and transformer of psychic energy with full participation of conscious understanding. These different relationships between ego and symbol give rise to two possible fallacies, which I shall call the concretistic fallacy and the reductive fallacy. In the concretistic fallacy, which is the more primitive of the two, the individual is unable to distinguish symbols of the archetypal psyche from concrete external reality. Inner symbolic images are experienced as being real, external facts. Examples of this fallacy are the animistic beliefs of primitives, hallucinations and delusions of psychotics, and superstitions of all kinds. Confused mixtures of psychic and physical realities, such as the practice of alchemy, astrology, and numerous present-day cults of healing fall into this category. The same fallacy is at work in those religious believers who misunderstand symbolic religious images to refer to literal concrete facts and mistake their own personal or parochial religious convictions for universal and absolute truth. There is danger of succumbing to the concretistic fallacy whenever we are tempted to apply a symbolic image to external physical facts for the purpose of manipulating those facts in or our own interest. Symbols have valid and legitimate effects only when they serve to change our psychic state or conscious attitude. Their effects are illegitimate and dangerous when applied in a magical way to physical reality. The reductive fallacy becomes the opposite mistake. In this case, the significance of the symbol is missed by misunderstanding it only as a sign from some other known content. The reductive fallacy is based on the rationalistic attitude, which assumes that it can see behind symbols to their real meaning. This approach reduces all symbolic imagery to elementary known factors. It operates on the assumption that no true mystery, no essential unknown transcending the ego's capacity for comprehension exists. Thus, in this view, there can be no true symbol, but only signs. For those of this persuasion, religious symbolism is no more than evidence of ignorance and primitive superstition. The reductive fallacy is also shared by those psychological theorists who consider symbolism to be no more than the primitive, pre-logical functioning of the archaic ego. We fall into this error whenever we treat our subjective reactions and images in the abstract, statistical manner appropriate to natural science and physical reality. This mistake is the reverse of the preceding one where a subjective symbolic image was used to manipulate physical facts, thus doing violence to them. Here, the abstract, objective attitude appropriate for an understanding of our outer reality is applied to the unconscious psyche in an attempt to manipulate it. This attitude does violence to the autonomous reality of the psyche. The conflict between the concretistic fallacy and the reductive fallacy is at the core of the contemporary conflict between the traditional religious view of man and the so-called modern scientific view. And since this is a collective problem, we all carry something of the conflict within ourselves. Concerning the problem, Jung writes, "Whoever talks of such matters as religious symbolism inevitably runs the risk of being torn to pieces by the two parties who are in mortal conflict about these very things. This conflict is due to the strange supposition that a thing is true only if it presents itself as a physical fact. Thus, some people believe it to be physically true that Christ was born as the son of a virgin, while others deny this as a physical impossibility. Everyone can see there is no logical solution to this conflict, and that one would do better not to get involved in such sterile disputes. Both are right and both are wrong, yet they could easily reach agreement if only they dropped the word physical. Physical is not the only criterion of truth. There are also psychic truths, which can neither be explained nor proved nor contested in any physical way. If, for instance, a general belief existed that the river Rhine had at one time flowed backwards from its mouth to its source, then this belief would in itself be a fact, even though such an assertion physically understood, would sound utterly incredible. Beliefs of this kind are psychic facts, which cannot be contested and need no proof. Religious or symbolic statements are of this type. They refer without exception to things that cannot be established as physical facts, taken as referring to anything physical that make no sense whatever. The fact that religious or symbolic statements frequently conflict with the observed physical phenomena proves that, in contrast to a physical perception, the symbolic spirit is autonomous, and that the psychic experience is to a certain extent independent of physical data. The psyche is an autonomous factor, and religious or symbolic statements are psychic confessions which, in the last resort, are based on unconscious processes. These processes are not accessible to physical perception, but demonstrate their existence through the confessions of the psyche. Whenever we speak of religious contents, we move in a world of images that point to something ineffable. We do not know how clear or unclear these images, metaphors, and concepts are in respect of their transcendental object. However, there is no doubt that there is something behind these images that transcends consciousness and operates in such a way that the statements do not vary limitlessly and chaotically, but clearly all relate to a few basic principles on archetypes. These, like the psyche itself or like matter, are unknowable as such. As with all matters pertaining to personality, the concretistic and reductive fallacies will not be changed by rational exhortation. Actually, they can be considered as two successive stages in personality development. The state of identification between ego and unconscious symbols gives rise to the concretistic fallacy. This state is characteristic of an early stage of ego development seen, for instance, in primitives and children. The reductive fallacy stems from a state of alienation between the ego and the symbolism of the unconscious. It seems to be a latter stage of development, perhaps a necessary reaction against the previous state of identity between ego and unconscious. At this point, ego development may require depreciation of the unconscious and of the power of its symbolic images. However, this leaves a dissociation between ego and unconscious, which sooner or later must be bridged if one is to become whole. The ultimate goal of Jungian psychotherapy is to make symbolic process conscious. To become conscious of symbols, we first need to know how a symbol behaves when it is unconscious. All the inhuman practices of savage rites and rituals, as well as neurotic symptoms and perversions, can be understood if we realize how a symbol functions unconsciously. The basic proposition is this: an unconscious symbol is lived but not perceived. The dynamism of the unconscious symbol is experienced only as a wish or an urgency towards some external action. The image behind the urgency is not seen. No purely psychological meaning is discerned behind the motivating force of the symbolic image which has one in its grip. The ego, identified with the symbolic image, becomes its victim, condemned to live out concretely the meaning of the symbol rather than to understand it consciously. To the degree that the ego is identified with the archetypal psyche, the dynamism of the symbol will be seen and experienced only as an urge to lust or power. This explains the distinction between the depth psychology of Jung and all other psychological theories. Only Jung and his school, so far, have been able to recognize the symbol, and therefore the archetypal psyche of which it is a manifestation, as it functions when the ego is not identified with it. In Freudian psychology, for instance, where Jung sees the transpersonal archetypal psyche, Freud sees the id. The id is a caricature of the human soul. The archetypal psyche and its symbols are seen only by the way they manifest themselves when the ego is identified with them. The id is unconscious, seen only as instinct with no consideration of the images that lie behind the instincts. To the extent that images are dealt with at all, they are reductively interpreted back to the instinct. The symbolic image, per se, is granted no substantive reality. This Freudian attitude towards the unconscious is important to understand because it is shared in one form or another by practically all the schools of modern psychotherapy. No psychiatrist will deny that the urgencies of the instinct are alive and effective, but they almost all join in denying the life and reality of symbolic images in and for themselves. The widespread attitude of modern psychology, which sees the unconscious psyche as motivated only by the instincts, is basically anti-spiritual, anti-cultural, and destructive of the symbolic life. To the extent that such an attitude is held, the cultivation of meaningful inner life is impossible. Instinctive compulsions do, of course, exist in abundance, but it is the symbolic image acting as a releaser and transformer of psychic energy which lifts the instinctive urgency to another level of meaning and humanizes, spiritualizes, and acculturates the raw animal energy. The instinct contains its own hidden meaning, which is revealed only by the perceiving the image that lies embedded in the instinct. One way of discovering the hidden image is by the process of analogy. As Jung says, quote, "The creation of analogies frees instinct and the biological sphere as a whole from the pressures of unconscious contents. Absence of symbolism, however, overloads the sphere of instinct." Close quote. As an example of the analogical method, I recall a patient who was in the unconscious grip of powerful unconscious grip of a powerful symbolic image which required him to live it out as a symptom until he could understand it consciously. Since it is easier to see large things than small ones, I choose an example that is magnified, so to speak, by the fact that it is a symptom of psychopathology. I am thinking of a case of transvestism, a young man who had a strong urge to dress in woman's clothes. When wearing some piece of feminine clothing, his attitude towards himself underwent a radical change. Ordinarily, he felt shy, inferior, and impotent. But when wearing some article of feminine apparel, which could be hidden from general view, he felt confident, effective, and sexually potent. Now, what does such a symptom mean? This patient was living out an unconscious symbolic image. Since such a symptom images have the same origin as dreams, we can approach them in the way we would a dream, by the method of amplification. We then ask ourselves, what about dressing in woman's clothes? What general and mythological parallels can we find? In Book 5 of Odyssey, Odysseus's journey between Calypso's isle and the land of Phaeacians is described. During this journey, Poseidon stirs up a frightful storm which would have drowned Odysseus, except that Ino, a sea goddess, comes to his assistance. She tells him to take off his clothes and swim for it, and adds, "Here, take my veil and put it around your chest. It is enchanted, and you can come to no harm so long as you wear it. As soon as you touch land, take it off. Throw it back as far as you can into the sea." Ino's veil is the archetypal image that lies behind the symptom of transvestism. The veil represents the support and containment which the mother archetype can provide the ego during a dangerous activation of the unconscious. It is legitimate to use this support, as Odysseus does, during a time of crisis, but the veil must be returned to the goddess as soon as the crisis is over. Another parallel is provided by the priests of Magna Mater in ancient Rome and Asia Minor. After the consecration, these priests would wear feminine dress and allow their hair to grow long to represent their commitment to the service of the Great Mother. A remnant of this sacerdotal transvestism exists today in the skirts worn by the Catholic clergy who are in the service of the Mother Church. These parallels go to show that the urge of the transvestite is based on the unconscious need for a supporting contact with feminine deity, the mother archetype. This is the way to understand such a symptom symbolically. Of course, whenever we speak of the image of a deity, we are using a symbol because a deity or a supra-personal power cannot be precisely defined. It is not a sign for something known and rationally understood, but rather a symbol of expressing a mystery. The manner of interpretations, if successful, can lead to the patient toward the symbolic life. A paralyzing, guilt-laden symptom can be replaced by a meaningful, life-enriching symbol which is experienced consciously rather than lived out in an unconscious, compulsive, symptomatic way. This case is an example of how a symptom can be transformed into a symbol through awareness of its archetypal foundations. Every symptom derives from the image of some archetypal situation. For instance, many anxiety symptoms have as their archetypal context the hero's fight with the dragon, or perhaps the rites of initiation. Many symptoms of frustration or resentment are a reenactment of Job's archetypal encounter with God. To be able to recognize the archetype, to see the symbolic image behind the symptom, immediately transforms the experience. It may be just as painful, but now it has meaning. Instead of isolating the sufferer from his fellow humans, he unites him with them in a deeper rapport. Now he feels himself a participating partner in the collective human enterprise. The painful evolution of human consciousness, which began in the darkness of the primordial swamp, and which will end we know not where. Intense moods and emotional states will also yield up their meaning if the relevant symbolic image can be found. For example, a man was in the grip of an angry mood. Things were not as he wished, but he could neither act out the affect nor repress it. Finally, he prayed for understanding of its meaning. Immediately the image came to him of the three men in the fiery furnace as described in the book of Daniel. He read this passage in the Bible. As he reflected on it, his mood disappeared. The third chapter of Daniel describes the decree of Nebuchadnezzar, that all people on signal shall fall down and worship his golden idol. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused, and Nebuchadnezzar, in a state of rage, had them thrown into the fiery furnace. But they remained unharmed, and a fourth figure was seen walking with them in the fire, like a son of God. This image resolved the angry mood because it expresses symbolically the meaning of the mood. King Nebuchadnezzar represents an arbitrary, tyrannical, power-driven figure who would usurp the prerogatives of God and rages when he is not treated as deity. He is the ego identified with the self. His rage is synonymous with the fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, by declining to give transpersonal value to a personal motivation, expose themselves willingly to the fire of Nebuchadnezzar's frustration. This would correspond to the patient's ability to avoid identification with the affect, but instead endure it and finally seek its meaning in active imagination. The fourth figure that appears in the furnace, like the Son of God, will represent the transpersonal archetypal component that was actualized in the experience. It brings meaning, release, and wholeness as the fourth. This example illustrates a statement of Jung about his confrontation with the unconscious. He writes, "I was living in a constant state of tension, to the extent that I managed to translate the emotions into images. That is to say, to find the images which were concealed in the emotions. I was inwardly calmed and reassured." To the extent that one is unaware of the symbolic dimension of existence, one experiences the vicissitudes of life as symptoms. Symptoms are disturbing states of mind which are unable to control and which are essentially meaningless, that is, contain no value or significance. Symptoms, in fact, are degraded symbols, degraded by the reductive fallacy of the ego. Symptoms are intolerable, precisely because they are meaningless. Almost any difficulty can be borne if we can discern its meaning. It is meaninglessness which is the greatest threat to humanity. Our waking life is composed of a series of moods, feelings, ideas, and urgencies. These successive psychic states through which we pass are like beads strung on a single string. Depending on our conscious attitude, we experience this rosary of life either as a succession of meaningless symptoms or symbolic awareness as a series of numinous encounters between the ego and transpersonal psyche. Our pleasures as well as our pains are symptoms if they carry no symbolic import. The sages of India recognize this in their doctrine of Maya. According to this view, pain and pleasure, which are the symptoms of life, are indissoluble, connected. To gain release from the painful symptoms, one must also relinquish the pleasurable symptoms. In terms of analytical psychology, the Indian striving for release from the urgencies of pain and pleasure is equivalent to the search for the symbolic life. Nirvana is not an escape from the reality of life. It is rather the discovery of the symbolic life which releases man from this awful, grinding, banal life, which is only a succession of meaningless symptoms. 3. The symbolic life. The symbolic life is in some form is a prerequisite for psychic health. Without it, the ego is alienated from its supra-personal source, and it falls victim to a kind of cosmic anxiety. Dreams often attempt to heal the alienated ego by conveying it to it some sense of its origin. Here is an example of such a dream. The dreamer was struggling with the problem of ego self-alienation. She was a prey to profound feelings of depression, unworthiness, and the meaninglessness of her life and capacities. Then she had this dream. An old man, who was both a priest and a rabbi, was talking to me. As I listened to his words, I was deeply moved and felt I was being healed. It seemed as though God spoke through him. I felt the eternal question which is always within me resolve itself. For a moment I knew why. As he talked, he put me back in touch with something I had known a long time ago, before I was born. This dream had a powerful impact on the dreamer. She experienced it as something healing. The eternal question concerning the meaning of our life was answered. But what was the answer? At first, upon awakening, she could not remember that the old man had said. Then suddenly she thought of an old Jewish legend she had once read in a book, and she realized that it was the essence of this legend which the priest rabbi had been telling her. The story of this legend is as follows. Prior to the birth of a child, God calls the seed of the future human being before him and decides what its soul shall become. Man or woman, sage or simpleton, rich or poor. Only one thing he leaves undecided, namely, whether he shall be righteous or unrighteous, for, as it is written, quote, all things are in the hand of the Lord except the fear of the Lord. Close quote. The soul, however, pleads with God not to be sent from the life beyond this world, but God makes answer, quote, the world to which I send thee is better than the world in which thou wast. And when I formed thee for this earthly fate. Close quote. Thereupon God orders the angel in charge of the souls living in the beyond to initiate the soul into all the mysteries of that other world, through paradise and hell. In such manner the soul experiences all the secrets of the beyond. At the moment of birth, however, when the soul comes to earth, the angel extinguishes the light of knowledge burning above it, and the soul, enclosed in its earthly envelope, enters this world, having forgotten its lofty wisdom, but always seeking to regain it. The dream which brought this beautiful legend to the dreamer's mind is an excellent example of the operation of the ego self-axis, which brings into consciousness an awareness of the ego's origin and meaning and awakens a symbolic life. The figure of the old man, the rabbi priest, is a representation of what Jung had called the archetype of the old wise man. He is a spiritual guide, a bringer of wisdom and healing. I would consider him to be a personification of the ego self-axis. In the combination of the priest and rabbi, he unites two separate religions and symbolic traditions, although the tale he has to tell does not belong to any particular religious system. The theme of the prenatal origins of the ego is an archetypal image of which we can find many examples. For instance, there is Plato's doctrine of prenatal ideas as elaborated in Phaedo. According to this myth, all learning is a recollection of prenatal knowledge which is innate but forgotten. In psychological terms, this means that the archetypal forms of human experience are pre-existence, or a priori. They only await incarnation within a particular individual life history. This Platonic theory of reminiscence is sometimes expressly stated in dreams. A person may dream of being involved in a significant happening which he dimly realizes has happened before and is following some predetermined plan. As one dreamer describes such a dream, it was as though I was experiencing the dream on two levels simultaneously. On the one hand, it was unique, spontaneous, and unrehearsed. On the other hand, I seemed also to be playing a role and reenacting a story I had once known but forgotten. The two levels were inextricably connected. I was playing the role perfectly just because I was really living it at the same time. I made up my lines as I went along, but I seemed to be helped by the fact that I had once known the story. When each situation came up, it struck some chord of memory which came to my assistance. Another parallel is an old Gnostic tale which has many similarities to the Jewish legend previously quoted, but carries it a step further by showing how the soul awakens and remembers its heavenly origin. Modern translators have entitled this text The Hymn of the Pearl. I quote it, somewhat abridged, from Hans Jonas's book. When I was a little child and dwelt in the kingdom of my father's house and delighted in the wealth and splendor of those who raised me, my parents sent me forth from the east, our homeland, with the provisions for the journey. They took off from me the robe of glory, which in their love they had made for me, and my purple mantle that was woven and conformed exactly to my figure, and made a covenant with me, and wrote it in my heart, that I might not forget it. Quote, when thou goest down into Egypt, and bringest the one pearl which lies in the middle of the sea, which is encircled by the snorting serpent, thou shalt put on again the robe of glory, and thy mantle over it, and with thy brother, our next in rank, be heir to our kingdom. Close quote. I left the east and took my way downwards, accompanied by two royal envoys. Since the way was dangerous and hard, and I was young for such a journey, I went down into Egypt, and my companions parted from me. I went straightway to the serpent, and settled down close by his inn until he should slumber and sleep, so that I might take the pearl from him. I was a stranger to my fellow dwellers in the inn. I clothed myself in their garments, lest they suspect me as one coming from without to take the pearl and arouse the serpent against me. But through some cause they marked that I was not their countryman. Then they ingratiated themselves with me, and mixed me, drink, with their cunning, and gave me to taste of their meat. And I forgot that I was a king's son, and served their king. I forgot the pearl for which my parents had sent me. Through the heaviness of their nourishment, I sank into a deep slumber. All this that befall me, my parents marked, and they were grieved for me. And they wrote a letter to me, and each of the great ones signed it with his name. Quote, from thy father, the King of Kings, and from thy mother, Mistress of the East, and from thy brother, our next in rank, unto thee, our son in Egypt, greeting. Awake and rise up thy sleep, and perceive the words of our letter. Remember thou art a king's son. Behold whom thou hast served in bondage. Be mindful of the pearl, for whose sake thou hadst departed into Egypt. Remember thy robe of glory. Recall thy splendid mantle, that thou mayest put them on, and deck thyself with them, and thy name be read in the book of the heroes, and then become with thy brother our deputy, heir in our kingdom." Close quote. Like a messenger was the letter. It rose up in the form of an eagle, the king of all winged fowl, and flew until it alighted beside me, and became holy speech. As its voice and sound, I awoke and arose from my sleep, took it up, kissed it, broke its seal, and read. Just as was written on my heart were the words of my letter to read. I remembered that I was the son of kings, and that my freeborn soul desired its own kind. I remembered that the pearl from which I had been sent down to Egypt, and I began to enchant the terrible and snorting serpent. I charmed it to sleep by naming over it by my father's name, the name of our next in rank, and that of my mother, the queen of the East. I seized the pearl and turned to repair home to my father. Their filthy and impure garment I put off, and left it behind in their land, and directed my way that I might come into the light of our homeland, the East. My letter which had awakened me I found before me on my way, and as it had awakened me with its voice, so it guided me with its light that shone before me, and with its voice it encouraged my fear. With its love it drew me on. Then, as he approached his homeland, his parents sent out to him his robe of glory and his mantle, and I stretched toward it, and I took it, and decked myself with the beauty of its colors, and I cast the royal mantle about my entire self. Clothed therein, I ascend to this gate of salutation and adoration. I bowed my head and adored the splendor of my father, who had sent it to me, whose commands I had fulfilled as he too had done what he promised. He received me joyfully, and I was with him in his kingdom. This charming tale is a beautiful symbolic expression of the theory of analytical psychology concerning the origin and development of the conscious ego. The ego begins as a child of a royal, heavenly family. This corresponds to its original state of identity with the self or archetypal psyche. It is sent away from this original paradise on a mission. This refers to the necessary process of conscious development which separates the ego from its unconscious matrix. When it reaches a foreign country, it forgets its mission and falls asleep. This situation corresponds to ego self-alienation and the state of meaninglessness. The letter from his parents awakens the sleeper and reminds him of his mission. Meaning has returned to his life. The connecting link between the ego and its supra-personal origins has been re-established. I would equate this happening with the awakening of symbolic awareness. There is a particularly interesting parallel between the story and the dream of the priest-rabbi. In the dream, after listening to the words of the wise old man, the dreamer remarks, "As he talked, he put me back in touch with something I had known a long time ago, before I was born." Similarly, in the Hymn of the Pearl, after the hero reads the letter, he says, "Just as written in my heart were the words of my letter." In each case, the individual is recalled to something he once knew before but had forgotten, his original nature. In the Hymn of the Pearl, the awakening is brought about through the agency of a letter. The protean nature of this letter suggests that it is a true symbol whose full meaning cannot be encompassed by a single specific image. It is a letter, but it is also an eagle. In addition, it is a voice that becomes holy speech. When it was time to make the return trip, the letter underwent still another metamorphosis and became a guiding light. Whenever we encounter in dreams in an image which undergoes such numerous transformations, we can be sure we are dealing with a particularly potent and dynamic symbol. Such a symbol is the letter eagle voice light image in this story. A letter is a means of communication from a distance. The eagle, stated in the text to be the king of the birds, reminds one of the fact that birds have always been considered the messengers of God. I once treated a psychotic patient who told me that he was receiving messages from God. When I asked him how he got those messages, he said that the birds brought them. Birds also suggest the dove of the Holy Ghost, which is the connecting link between God and man. The voice reminds one of the call or the vocation, which means literally a calling. This theme has always expressed an experience of awakening which leads the individual out of his personal preoccupations into a more significant destiny. This letter as a guiding light is paralleled by the Star of Bethlehem, which guided man to the birthplace of Christ, the manifestation of deity. All of these amplifications go to show that the letter in its various aspects symbolizes the ego-self axis, the line of communication between ego and archetypal psyche. Consciousness of this axis has an awakening, transforming effect on the personality. A new dimension of meaning is discovered, which conveys value to subjectivity. Another example of the archetypal theme of the prenatal origin of the soul is found in Wordsworth's ode, Intimations of Immortality. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath at elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar, not in entire forgetfulness, and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come, from God who is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy, shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy. But he beholds the light, and whence it flows, he sees it in his joy. The youth, who daily farther from the east must travel, still in nature's priest, and by the vision splendid is on his way attended. At length the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day. At this point, Wordsworth's hero reaches Egypt, forgetting his mission, and falls asleep. He never does receive a definite letter of awakening, but he has premonitions of one. And in a season of calm weather, though inland far we be, our souls have sight of the immortal sea, which brought us hither. Can a moment travel thither, and see the children sport upon the shore, and hear the mighty waters rolling evermore? Thanks to the human heart by which we live, thanks to its tenderness, its joys and fears, to the meanest flower that blows can give, thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears. In the last two lines there is a definitive allusion to the symbolic life. Dreams are expressions of the ego-self axis. Every dream can be considered a letter sent to Egypt to awaken us. We may not be able to read the letter, but at least we should open it and make the effort. I know of a man who had no use for analysis and dream interpretation. He had studied his own dreams and reached the definite conclusion that the dreams had no meaning whatever. They are caused only by one's physical sensations, which in bed, having one's feet tangled in the covers, lying on one's arm, that sort of thing. It is interesting to know what kind of dreams the man with such a conscious attitude had. He had several frequently recurring nightmares. He dreamt he was in a quagmire up to his knees, sinking deeper and deeper, unable to move. At other times he dreamt that he was blind, and sometimes that he was crippled, paralytic. Sometimes dream images refer directly to the functioning of the ego-self axis. This is true of the dream about the priest-rabbi. I've encountered several dreams which use the image of an island needing a communication system with the mainland. Here is an example of such a dream. A man dreamt that he was on an island several miles off the mainland. A great pile of telephone cables comes up on the beach. It is connected with the mainland, and the dreamer feels he has rescued it from destruction by recognizing what it is. It is an important advance in communications. His neighbors think it is ugly and want to throw him back into the sea, but the dreamer is able to persuade them of its value. The fact that the neighbors object to the ugliness of the telephone cable is significant. The dreamer has a highly developed aesthetic sense. Indeed, his major value judgments are based on aesthetic considerations. In order to accept the new communication pathway with the mainland, that is, the archetypal psyche, the dreamer must oppose the tyranny of aestheticism which recognizes no values other than its own. This is an illustration of the fact that the ego self-axis and the symbolic life are encountered through the inferior function, the weakest portion of the personality. Only by awareness and acceptance of our weakness do we become conscious of something beyond the ego which supports us. Here is another dream which is a beautiful example of the ego self-axis and of the numinous impact it can have. The patient had this dream about 1 year prior to beginning analysis during a time of considerable distress. Although his psychotherapy was long and arduous, the dream portended eventual success. I am on the roof of a room, completely surrounded by water, when I hear wonderful music coming across the water. The music is being brought by 4 wise men, standing in small boats, and each is coming from one of the 4 directions. They are magnificently robed as they proceed across the water through a blue-gray dawn. I realize that the music each one of them brings bears the characteristics of the direction from which he comes. These 4 musical qualities blend and merge into a sound which affects me powerfully in writing about it 3 years later, as it did when it occurred in the dream. The 4 wise men ascend stairs at each corner of the room. I am overcome with a feeling of great reverence and excitement. As they reach the roof, it has grown lighter. The nearness of them is overwhelming. I realize they have come to prepare me for the doing of some work. I then must go downstairs and complete some task which requires prolonged diligence and concentration. When I come back, I see the 4 wise men going back across the waters in their small boats. Though there is a sense of disappointment, the music seemed more glorious than before, even triumphant. There was definitely a sense of having succeeded or passed the test. Then I saw that in the place where each wise man had stood, there was now a stone idol, which, though abstract, not only intrinsically represented the wise man, but indeed all that was implied by the culture and mores of the direction for which he had come. There was a sense of being thankful that I would be able to prove that they had been there. Then I turned my attention to the 4 wise men, each returning to his own direction in the small boats, and the music became even greater. Once more I heard, with the special clarity of the special personality of each of the 4 directions, blending mysteriously into a super musical sound, and the day became brighter until an electric blue surrounded me, and a sense of the most intense well-being I had ever felt me in my dream had ended. I do not want to discuss the dream and its personal aspects, but only to the extent that it illustrates the function of the ego self-axis. The drama of the dream takes place on the roof of a room, which is a kind of platform raised above the water with steps at each of its 4 corners. This reminds me of the early Egyptian concept of the god Atum. He was represented as the world mound rising out of the primeval ocean. According to Clark, the primordial mound symbol was soon formalized into an eminence with sloping or battered sides or a platform surrounded by steps on each side. It is probably what the step pyramids represent. Another analogy is the Babylonian ziggurat. Likewise, a holy mound with steps on 4 sides leading to a platform on top which housed the shrine of Marduk. The top of the holy mound was thought of as the navel of the world, the point where divine creative force is manifested, and the place of meeting between God and man. The same ideas were associated with the pyramids of the Mayas. The image of the wise men bringing gifts reminds us of the story of Jesus' nativity and the 3 wise men. This theme of bringing gifts to the newborn child is part of the myth of the birth of the hero, which, we can add, is also the myth of the birth of the ego. But what is the significance of 4 wise men instead of 3? There is a legend that when Jesus was born, not 3, but 4 wise men were supposed to have come to him from the 4 corners of the world, but the 4th was delayed and did not arrive in time. The fact that there are 4 wise men coming from the 4 directions alludes to mandala symbolism and indicates that the wise men are a function of the self, or psychic totality. The wise men thus represent a 4-fold ego self-axis. They are messengers and gift bringers. From the land beyond, the sea come to establish communication with the ego. We are reminded of the previous priest-rabbi dream, where likewise an old wise man served to connect the dreamer with her supra-personal origins. I would draw your attention to the light symbolism in this dream. The dream begins at dawn. It grows lighter as the wise men reach the roof, and it becomes still brighter at the climax of the dream. Light represents consciousness. All peoples have myths of creation which depict it as the creation of light. Such myths refer to the creation of the ego, which is the light of consciousness born out of the darkness of the unconscious. Similarly, dawn is the daily birth of the light of the sun and is an apt image to represent emerging consciousness. Thus we can understand this dream as referring to a growth or increase of consciousness on the part of the dreamer. The interpretation would also correspond to the significance of the wise men, who attribute as wisdom. Wisdom is light in the psychological sense. The wise men are bringers of the light of consciousness. Another feature of the dream is that which wise man leaves behind an idol or an image of himself, which epitomizes the direction from which he comes and provides tangible proof of the reality of his visit. This is most interesting. I understand it as a representation of the symbolic process itself. The archetypal forces represented by the wise men bring images of themselves as gifts to the ego, symbols that remind the individual of the suprapersonal connections. These images would correspond in their function to the letter, eagle, and guiding light in the hymn of the pearl. They are the connecting links between ego and archetypal psyche, which transmit symbolic meaning. The word symbol derives from the Greek word symbolon, which combines two root words, sim, meaning together or with, and bolon, which meaning that which has been thrown. The basic meaning is thus, that which has been thrown together. In original Greek usage, symbols referred to the two halves of an object, such as a stick or a coin, which two parties broke between them as a pledge and to prove later the identity of the presenter of one part to the holder of the other. The term corresponded to our word tally, concerning which Webster's Unabridged Dictionary states it was customary for traders, after notching a stick to show the number or quantity of delivered goods, to split it lengthwise to the notches so the parts exactly corresponded, the seller keeping one stick and the purchaser the other. A symbol was thus originally a tally, referring to the missing piece of an object, which when restored to, or thrown together with, its partner recreated the original whole object. This corresponds to our understanding of the psychological function of a symbol. The symbol leads us to the missing part of the whole man. It relates us to our original totality. It heals our split, our alienation from life. And since the whole man is a great deal more than the ego, it relates us to the supra-personal forces, which are the source of our being and our meaning. This is the reason for honoring subjectivity and cultivating the symbolic life.